I hope you had an opportunity to network. And we're going to continue on this afternoon. Some excellent presentations. So it's my pleasure first to introduce Dr. Aaron Franks, who's been sort of part of our Data Champions Network program since its inception, and gave a fantastic lecture during our webinar series. And it's great to have him part of today. And Aaron is going to talk about OCAP, First Nations data sovereignty and research data management. So Aaron, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here with, I believe, a national network. As David said, I have been involved with this network in the past, and gave a webinar to Ottawa-based biomedical data champions. So this is a pleasure, and thanks David and Anna for inviting me to speak today. I was going to come in person, but I'm a little under the weather, and I didn't want to risk contaminating anyone. So I am actually speaking to you from my office on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory, and where you are as well, a few miles away from me. I work at the First Nations Information Governance Center, and my role here is a senior manager for research in the First Nations principles of OCAP and information governance. And it is my pleasure to share some information with you today on the OCAP principles, First Nations data sovereignty, and research data management. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And it always takes a tiny bit of time to sort that out. Share and slideshow. Now, can I get a signal from an organizer that you can see my slides but not my notes?
I can see your PowerPoint, not the slide itself, but the actual PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. Let me try this again. End slideshow. Okay, so slideshow from the beginning. How about now?
Could you try stop sharing and resharing your screen quickly?
Yeah, and give me 1 second here. All right, stopping sharing. And I'm going to share the screen. PowerPoint slideshow. There we go. Let's try that.
Perfect.
You can see my title slide?
Yes.
Very handsome young boy on it?
Exactly.
Okay, great. All right, well, we'll get started. Again, my name is Aaron Franks. I work at FNIGC. This is the second time I'm speaking with the network, and I believe there's a national audience here, so it's a pleasure to speak to people from coast to coast to coast on all manner of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit lands. So we'll get started here. I think I've got half an hour, and we're going to obviously leave some time for questions. So I'm going to go fairly briskly, and I'm going to set myself a timer. All right. Today we're going to learn a little bit about FNIGC, and I'll give you a bird's eye view of our work. And we'll, of course, focus mainly on First Nations data and the First Nations principles of OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession. We'll talk a little bit about the longstanding, difficult research and data governance environment that First Peoples have been subjected to, both in terms of research and data collection, and also, of course, the continued governance and management of that data. And we will, of course, want to focus on some of the very good work that's happening, not only, of course, at FNIGC, but around the territory, coast to coast to coast, on First Nations and other First People reclaiming their data, fostering their data governance, and advancing data sovereignty in partnership with others. So a little bit about FNIGC. So we've been around for 13 years now. We were incorporated as a freestanding, not-for-profit service and support center for First Nations. We're a technical, non-political organization. Our role really is to provide the best possible data collection and data stewardship activities with First Nations, and to do applied research on issues that are impact data governance and First Nations' right to assert their data sovereignty. And of course, we do awareness raising and education and training along with that as well. So we're 13 years old, although our roots are in work much longer, deeper than that. FNIGC began as a regionally organized committees, First Nations leadership and researchers coming together to design and develop and roll out the first, and I believe still only, First Nations governed and designed quantitative surveys on a variety of health and well-being and wellness questions. And of course, the OCAP principles, which were coined in 1998, are 25 years old this year. We are really a national coordinating center. We're not a rights-holding body or a government. And through our governance process, local First Nations come together at the regional level in a variety of ways, and FNIGC provides services and helps coordinate data-related activities at the national level where that's appropriate. And we'll speak about that a little bit later towards the end. Some really positive developments there. So our vision is that every First Nation will achieve data sovereignty in keeping with its own distinct worldview. And there's a lot of text here under our mission, but I'll point out that the primary way we work is through regional and national partnerships. We're a small organization with a very large mandate, and we really work through brokering conversations, fostering dialogue, and doing research on key questions and developing knowledge translation products for First Nations communities and leadership and their partners. So I've already told you a little bit about FNIGC here. I think I've gotten ahead of myself a little bit, but I'll fill in some blanks here with this handy set of lists. So in terms of education, training, and capacity development, we focus on First Nations data sovereignty and information governance and management. You can really think of information governance and information management as important practices in advancing the overarching goal of self-determination and data sovereignty. Clearly, that is through the lens of the OCAP principles. And as we'll touch on it towards the end here, we're also the stewards of the First Nations data governance strategy. There's some interesting developments there in terms of developing infrastructure and capacity. As I said, we do research. We do a couple of broad kinds of research. What I work with here and my team is questions on data governance and of course data sovereignty. These tend to be around challenges and opportunities in legislation, not just Canadian legislation, but First Nations laws and protocols as relates to information governance and stewardship. Increasingly technical questions around data architecture, data systems, and even some, of course, theoretical questions, which are never really abstract, but actually very, very concrete when it comes to differences in cultures and worldviews and how we value data and information and how to best put data and information to use. And of course, we also do more quantitative research with the high quality survey data that we collect and steward. We write reports ourselves and in collaboration with other First Nations and other allied researchers on a variety of topics. Broadly connected to health, well-being, housing, educational attainment, incomes, livelihoods, that kind of thing. And that data is derived from our national surveys. And the regional health survey at the top there is the longest standing survey. It started, I think, as a pilot. It was back in 93 or 94. Originally intended as a longitudinal study that would also include Inuit communities as well. And it's since evolved to a non-longitudinal study that focuses on First Nations on reserve in northern communities. Before I forget here, it's really important to mention for you that we are a couple months into a CIHR funded research project, 3-year project on First Nations approaches to biobanking ethics, to the opportunities and risks of biobanking, collection and storage of biological and genetic data, I encourage you to get a hold of us here at FNIGC and find out more about that. And I'll leave my contact information at the end. So that is a little nutshell of FNIGC and the work we do. We are the stewards of the OCAP principles at the national level, and I'll explain what I mean by that here in a moment. But look, maybe we'll start with where we need to start, and that is with First Nations data and what it is. So we have a definition of First Nations data that I think is both very broad, but also quite specific as well. So First Nations data is any data about First Nations or from First Nations and about or derived from First Nations resources, territories, and environments. So there's sort of three main categories that we think of when it comes to First Nations data. The data from First Nations, we think of as data that's could only ever come from First Nations, that's specific to First Nations culture, language, relationship to territory, the knowledges that are both oral and written and pictographic. It includes regalia, songs, ceremonies, ceremonial objects, ancestors. Data about First Nations is data that's about First Nations, often in the same sense that data is collected about anybody else. And this tends to be data about demographic data, administrative data, housing, health, labor, education, that kind of thing. And of course, data from or about First Nations lands and waters, including the medicines and the animals, the air, and everything within that territory. So if you think about that, you might better ask what's not First Nations data. Clearly, biomedical data is part of this. We know that there are a lot of research data management challenges specific to biomedical data. My understanding of this data is that it's data that's collected from people in the act of giving healthcare. And so it's not administrative data. So when I give my name and my date of birth at an emergency room or my OHIP number, that is administrative data. If blood's taken from me or other samples, an X-ray, whatever, that becomes biomedical data. And I understand that there's a lot of questions about the appropriate use of that data for purposes other than providing medical treatment. So where is First Nations data? Well, it's often not with First Nations. Indigenous Services Canada and the Government of Canada, you can see that blob down there in the lower left. ISC itself holds over 200 databases about First Nations people, and that's just ISC. That's not including any of the other government agencies. Governments also do their own research, and of course, in addition to the massive university, college, and research hospital and other research institute sector. The private sector has First Nations data, particularly but not exclusively in the resource sector, as environmental impact assessments and other studies are done. What we sometimes call the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, is together an enormous sector that has a lot of First Nations data. You can imagine not just the ancestors and objects that are held in galleries and museums, but the rich metadata and associated data around these objects. And this is an issue that FNIGC as a technical organization is very attuned to, is that, data begets data, and the data has metadata attached to it, and how we describe data through metadata is critically important. And of course, to add to this list, biomedical data would be held by the publicly funded health sector, and of course, publicly funded medical research institutes, often attached to universities. There may be biomedical data increasingly in the private sector when it comes to things like special repositories for example, blood and other samples and DNA and that kind of thing. So we know that First Nations data encompasses a lot, anything from or about First Nations, or from or about First Nations lands and waters, medicines and animals. So what are the principles of OCAP? Well, the principles of OCAP are a longstanding framework for First Nations in Canada and the northern half of Turtle Island to assert their data sovereignty. And OCAP belongs collectively to all First Nations. First Nations are free to interpret these principles of ownership, control, access, and possession in ways that suit their own governance needs and worldviews. We are the stewards at the national level of the principles. So we have a special responsibility for awareness raising, education, and training. Back in 2015, the FNIGC trademarked the acronym and the logo, not in a sense of owning the principles, but as a protective measure to make sure that the term OCAP wasn't being misused or applied in the wrong way by non-First Nations governments and researchers. So it's important to remember that these are First Nations principles. They're not pan-Indigenous. Inuit and Métis nations and communities have developed and are developing their own data governance standards. I direct you to the National Strategy for Inuit Research produced by ITK a little while ago. And increasingly, various Métis nations are using the OCAS principles, ownership, control, access, and stewardship, and the Red River CART framework. So how does OCAP work? Well, I think you get a lot of versions of that, but I think that it works in three primary ways, and they're nested inside of each other. Primarily, well, no, not primarily, pardon me. I think, let's say basically, these principles are standards for collecting, protecting, and using and sharing First Nations data. In some ways, they are related to an ethics framework, that they establish a floor or a bare minimum for how First Nations data should be collected. I don't think that's really the most important way OCAP operates. OCAP's also, in a sense, promoting advancing a whole perspective on data collection and research that is quite different in many ways from Western or mainstream versions of that, where the ethical consideration is in minimizing or not doing harm. The OCAP lens sort of takes that as a given, but it's actually about promoting benefits, the benefits of data collection, proper data governance, and data analysis for First Nations communities from which that data is taken or from where that data is collaboratively developed. And you can see that this is nested inside a larger objective, which we'll talk about here in a moment, that it's really about supporting self-determination and advancing self-government through the preservation and development of identity and culture. So to be able to control the collection and use of your data is really to be able to participate actively and control the telling of the story of your own nation, community, and people. So I'll go through the four principles. I'll go through them a little bit quickly because we do want to leave time for questions and other elements. So ownership. First Nations are the rightful owners of their data, regardless of where the data is housed or held. And in the most fundamental sense, collective ownership over data allows First Nations to take ownership, yes, over data, but over their own identity and over the narration of their own story, not allowing others to define who they are, certainly not to themselves, but also not defining First Nations against other groups of people. Control is broader, but I think it's still worth specifying. I think the key with control is that it stresses that First Nations are able to control the entire process of data collection, data analysis, data governance, and data disposition, including determining should that data even be collected or stored in the first place. So I think of control as really about, let's draw attention to the whole spectrum of data collection and governance activities. So in the case of biomedical data, the idea of control is really about, should this data be accessible to researchers or non-First Nation governments at all? And if it is, through its life cycle, how will it be used? And then how will it be disposed of? How will it be destroyed or archived? Access seems a little self-evident, but there's two very important aspects of access. The first, of course, is that First Nations need to have access to their own data, to data that is from or about them or from or about their lands and territories. The other element is that First Nations need to have control over who else has access and under what conditions. Possession. The principle of possession is a very interesting one. And it was added a little bit later to the collection of principles. So the principles were developed through the mid to late 90s through the process of reclaiming ownership over the data collection process of these national surveys that I had talked about. So with the development of national surveys comes, of course, the need to have transparent First Nations developed and First Nations controlled frameworks for the collection and use of this data. So OCAP is born from very long-standing ideas of sovereignty and governance and the need to interact with and confront ways that data has been taken from First Nations. So possession was added after the OC and the A as kind of a keystone principle. So First Nations must be able to bring any data or information collected by them or about them into their jurisdiction, whether by possession within their territory or by First Nations exercising their jurisdiction through other means. And this becomes very critical, of course, in this day of digital data and complex data sets that are held in diffuse locations in the cloud and through networks. That if First Nations data is not necessarily brought back into the community or within the jurisdiction of the First Nation government, the First Nation needs to maintain the authority to exercise their jurisdiction over their data in a complex or mixed system. So why is this necessary? Well, the fact of the matter is that the Colonial Act of Extractive Research has been going on for a very long time. And while that maybe has diminished, maybe to a great degree, or hopefully to an increasing degree, there are still very much a colonial information governance regime that First Nations and other First Peoples are contending with. So First Nations rights and agency in the area of their own data and research has been violated repeatedly, and OCAP is a sort of protective measure. But more proactively, it's also a way of saying, you know, not only do we want to minimize harm and not be harmed by research or stigmatized by it, we want to realize the benefits of research conducted in our own way and the benefits of good long-term data governance conducted in our own way. So we've got here a spectrum of colonial research and then the harms that are less visible but still there of colonial information governance. So a couple of quick examples here, and there are many. These are examples that we use in our online course, the fundamentals of OCAP, which I'll pitch again towards the end here. So in the mid-'80s at the University of British Columbia, there was a researcher who received a grant from Health Canada to conduct a study on arthritis, which was endemic in the Nuu-chah-nulth Nation on what's now Vancouver Island. He took 880 some vials of blood, which I believe at the time was about the largest collection of blood samples from a single Indigenous nation for research purposes. Now, his study didn't reveal any significant findings, which of course would be disappointing, but you know, it's science and that does happen. The difficulties are that he did not maintain a relationship with the nation. He did not relay the results of the work. He simply arrived at the conclusion that the study was inconclusive and moved on and took the samples with him to at least two universities, Utah and Oxford. And these samples were used to do other forms of research that were not consented to by the community. They were shared and loaned to other researchers. The samples and the resultant research was used to generate grants and further careers and write papers. And the research that was done with the blood was done in areas that were not only not consented to, but were actually disrespectful of the Nuu-chah-nulth people and their own creation stories, their existence on Vancouver Island, using the blood samples to support theories about crossing the Bering Strait land bridge and other contested theories of migration. So that's extractive, harmful research. More broadly, the Canadian government overcollects and underutilizes the data that it does collect. So in 2018, the Auditor General's report stated that at the time that what was Indigenous Services Canada at the time, INAC and ESDC, require data from First Nations through all kinds of reporting streams for various funds and programs, but they do not use that burdensome huge amount of data well. So essentially, to quote the AG, they are not measuring and reporting on progress to close socioeconomic gaps. Lack of performance indicators to determine if programs are effective. And we recommend that First Nations are engaged on decision-making and getting better and more accurate information. Now that was, I believe, the third such report, the third such mention of overcollection and underutilization of First Nations data in an Auditor General's report. And lastly, the legislative and legal environment that First Nations governments need to operate in is not amenable to protecting First Nations data rights. The Privacy Act does not recognize or protect collective privacy. So they are under the Privacy Act, governments can exchange information with one another in order to have that governmental relationship. And that information is privileged and not accessible to the government. So for example, here locally, on information shared between Ontario and Ottawa, the federal government, is not accessible through access to information requests. Same with information that a municipality might supply. Although First Nations are considered self-governing, they are not accorded the same privacy rights. So the masses of information that Indigenous Service Canada and other agencies collect on First Nations, including some health data, is available to the public through ATIP requests. Longer term, the Library and Archives of Canada Act mandates that all records in the control of federal departments or institutions be transferred to the National Archive when they're no longer in use. So what this does is that it entrenches the accessibility of all of that First Nations data sort of in perpetuity. So when Canada has this archive, once it's in the archive, even personal information becomes vulnerable to access to information requests 10 to 20 years after someone's death. So when I pass away, the records, any records that the federal government holds about me will eventually go to Library and Archives Canada. When I pass away, even personally identifying information will be available about me through Library and Archives Canada, any of my interactions with the government. Now imagine as a First Nations government where you're required to report all sorts of particular details about your people and your governance to the federal government. None of that information is protected at all. So in this context, extractive research, poor information governance, a information governance and legislative regime that's anathema to First Nations data interests. How can we overcome this? Well, data sovereignty is a powerful concept that's got a lot of traction internationally, and of course, increasingly here in Canada, Turtle Island as well. And the story here that we want to share and hope that you leave with is one of collective rights to collective resources. So people's data and people's information are a collective resource. And First Nations as self-determining, self-governing rights holders have an inherent right to govern their lands, peoples, and resources, including this collective data resource. And these rights are confirmed in the Canadian Constitution, in the Charter of Human Rights, and more recently in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or UNDRIP. So these rights are only realized if a First Nation can exercise authority over its data and information. So data sovereignty, First Nations data sovereignty, means First Nations data being governed by First Nations laws, protocols, and policies. And there's a virtuous circle here of strengthened First Nation governance means increasing the capacity for First Nations to make better use of their own data. And when First Nations have better access and are making better use of their own data, they are building their own capacity for nation rebuilding and self-governance. And it sometimes feels odd to mention this because it's probably a state that is so taken for granted. You need to be able to pull back and say, in this world that's saturated with information and data flows, governments take it as a right that they are that the Canadian government's data is a protected special resource for the Canadian government, used for the benefit of Canadian people. Now, of course, we can argue that all kinds of decisions are made that might run against that, but that is the intent, and that's the sort of social contract. Indigenous peoples are recognized as self-determining and self-governing increasingly globally, and here in Canada, and have been for a very long time. But in practice, the right to our own information and data is not yet there. So while colonial states are able to assert data sovereignty as a given, we need to punch through that given and say, hey, Indigenous peoples are only recently able to stake their claim here in this space. So a little bit more about UNDRIP and a little bit about the UNDA. So under UNDRIP, very important to recognize this. Indigenous individuals have rights, and Indigenous peoples collectively have rights that are indispensable for their well-being and development as distinct peoples. So this is not just about a atomistic private conception of rights. This is about the collective rights of a people. They have a right to self-determination, to social, cultural, and economic development, to exercising their right to self-determination, to have autonomy and self-government in matters relating to internal affairs, and critically from that, to maintain and strengthen distinct political, legal, economic, and social and cultural institutions. So it's a nested thing again: self-determination, socioeconomic, cultural development, autonomy and self-government. And to achieve autonomy and self-government, you need lasting, appropriate institutions to maintain that. And data sovereignty is an essential element of these rights. So how do we do this work together? It's really important for people encountering OCAP and data sovereignty to reflect on their positionality here. So this is a matter of collective rights. Ownership, control, access, and possession are rights for First Nations to assert and exercise over their data. And it's the responsibility of others to learn about this and to give space for that to happen, and to seed resources and make space and help support capacity for this to happen. So locally in Canada, but to just reflect on the UNDRIP, the UNDA was passed into law here in Canada, and that confirms that the UNDRIP is a source of interpretation of Canadian law. And the federal government action plan for the UNDA is actually due in a couple of months. So self-determination, self-governance, the right to develop your own institutions, and the right to govern your own data is clearly now a matter of law. It is a settled matter of law. So in the last 3 or 4 minutes here, we've taken this quite big, and I want to narrow down the focus to First Nations and research institutions, including biomedical research institutions. Now, this is a general sort of map. It's not just about medicine. But within research and research institutions and universities, we have a variety of silos and a variety of places where First Nations data can be kept or interacted with. Offices of research services, research ethics boards, the whole notion of commercialization and intellectual property. Increasingly, through the federal government, as percolated down through the alliance and the tri-agencies, research data management. The data collection and the practices associated with giving grants and research funding. First Nations students and staff in research institutions, data about them, graduation rates, attainment, professional development, lands, waters, and territories. Does your research institute or university or college have a relationship with the First Nations around you? Immediately, I think of the University of Saskatchewan and the Saskatchewan Tribal Council, and I'm sure that is replicated in lots of different places where universities are on First Nations land, and not last but not least, biomedical data. So that's a long list of where First Nations data is encountered. It can be held in a single institution. So if you're on a research ethics board, you might work with researchers who are putting in applications. You're engaging with the tri-agencies, TCPS2, maybe Chapter 9, First Nations themselves perhaps, and your Office of Research Services. First Nations experiencing the same system, the hallway they have to walk down is much, much larger. So others have sliced First Nations data into different ways. research data is a matter of ethics, commercialization, research data management, the data associated with grants and research funding, education. We're looking at administrative data, student achievement data, the data and information that might be used in the development of curriculum. So, for example, this right now is a professional development seminar. What is your relationship to the story that I'm telling you about OCAP and data sovereignty? This is a First Nations led story about First Nations principles of OCAP. So what does OCAP look like right now? Well, OCAP is widely understood and widely asserted and respected. First Nations have a variety of data governance and data sharing agreements in place, including in Ontario, the Institute of Clinical Evaluative Sciences agreement with the Chiefs of Ontario. We have our own First Nations Data Center. The First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba has the Health Information Research Governance Committee. And there are non-First Nations who are building understanding and respect for OCAP into their policies, including Saskatchewan, the Association of Canadian Archivists, and the Common Approach to Information, Common Approach to Indicator Development. I'm out of time here, so this is a bit of a repeat. I'm not going to linger on that. I do want to mention the First Nations Data Center. It's really important to recognize that First Nations do have infrastructure that's First Nations developed and led. So we steward the data collected through our surveys. It can be accessed after a process of ethical approval through application. And I encourage you to go to our website and look at what we have to offer. The First Nations data governance strategy is another piece of important First Nations infrastructure. For 6 or 7 years now, this has been on the radar of the Assembly of First Nations. FNIGC received modest funding in 2018 to develop engagements to develop a document, a strategy that was done in consultation with community members and First Nations leadership. And as of 2021, we have received over $50 million to develop a First Nations data governance strategy, which centers on the development of regional First Nations information governance centers. So I encourage you to go to our website and read about the strategy. It's got really strong implications for the future of the institutions you guys as medical practitioners and medical researchers will be working with in the future with First Nations. I'm going to end it there to give us a few minutes to talk. That's my contact information. Please go to our website. It's a really rich source of information. We have an online library. We have information on education and training. We have information on the Data Governance Center and the Data Governance Strategy. And I think that's good for me. Thanks very much.
Very much, Larry. I just want to check. No, that's an older question. Any questions from the in-person audience? Yes, our University of Toronto.
Thanks, Aaron and Stefan Wilson, University of Toronto. Thank you for a brilliant summary of your issues and how you put together the issue of data sovereignty for First Nations. I wonder if you can comment on the language of data sovereignty is now rising in other circles. The extent to which the arguments put forward, particularly nation-to-nation kind of discussion, is unique to First Nations, or how much others can draw from the rich experience you've had of working up data governance and data sovereignty. Is that a parallel discussion we can have, or to what extent can we draw from what you've done?
Did you get that question? I don't know if you heard it.
I struggled a little bit to hear it. If you could give the main part of it, that would be helpful. Thank you.
There are groups other than First Nations who have started discussing the idea of data sovereignty over their groups. And I'm wondering the extent to which the arguments that have been drawn for First Nations data sovereignty, generalizable, or it's really strongly related to the First Nations and the UNDRIP perspective on.
Did I hear that correctly? The question is essentially about other communities and groups who are talking about data sovereignty, claiming sovereignty over their data.
Yes.
And what is the relationship between that and what I've shared here with?
Yes.
Yes, that's an excellent question. And we actually work increasingly with BIPOC allies in this space. I'll just preface this by saying I wish I knew more about that work, and it is. I'm shouting a little bit here. I probably don't need to. Just because I'm struggling to hear there doesn't mean you're struggling to hear me. There are, you know, I don't like this language necessarily. Equity-seeking groups, Black and people of color communities who are, I'm sure in other ways, but no doubt in health and also in policing and corrections data and probably in education data, looking to control the collection, use, and analysis of data in order to tell their own story, not from a deficit perspective. That is very closely allied to the OCAP principles and the perspective that FNIGC brings. I think it's also often discussed in a decolonial or decolonization context of Black people and people of color who historically have come to North America through different circumstances that were not entirely voluntary or not voluntary at all. And I think that asking really, really important questions about the Canadian state and society and who's represented and best served. And I have a lot of time for discussing those questions. I think there is a key difference, though, in that the First Nations principles of OCAP are grounded in the reality of Indigenous nations as self-determining, self-governing nations that existed before colonization and that are still existing and thriving today from coast to coast to coast. So there becomes a question not just of it's a question of it's a social question, but it's also a question of jurisdiction and sovereignty. I'll just one more point. We've also there's interesting overlap between the collective privacy rights and some of the work that's happened in pushing back against things like smart cities, where neighborhoods, not so much, it's not about an ethnicity or an Indigenous nation. It's about a neighborhood saying, we don't want this kind of surveillance. We don't want our information shared in this way. And again, very interesting dialogue to have there, but important to remember that the First Nations rights to their own data are rooted in First Nations reality as self-governing.
Thank you, Aaron. So there's two online questions, if we can get to those. So one is from Karen Breek, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. How, if at all, does your office and OCAP principles interlink to research done within federal government on Indigenous members for employment equity, recruiting, retention purposes, such as is found at the Department of National Defence, Canadian Armed Forces and Veterans Affairs?
Yeah, I don't know if I've got a very good answer to that question. I think, well, our office does not interlink with the federal government there on those questions, or with First Nations on those questions. I think more broadly speaking, it's a question of people's right to self-identify or not First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, and then there is a data governance question over how that information is put to use. So I don't have a very strong answer for you on that, but we have not been asked to comment on that or engage with the federal government on that when it comes to collecting of data for employment equity issues.
Okay, thank you. And another question from Paul Hendry. Thanks for the presentation regarding the hospital-based clinical trial trying to ensure diverse inclusion of Indigenous peoples are being included in a specific demographic in a drug trial with blood and other data being collected. What are the First Nations expectations about access to their collective data? Thanks.
I think First Nations expectations for access would be quite varied. I can tell you a little bit and very briefly about the biobanking ethics work that we're doing, where there are First Nations and First Nations service organizations that are really attuned to this. I wish I could remember off the top of my head, but there are First Nations that want to develop their own biobanks. They want that infrastructure in their communities, which would imply a really high level of interest in accessing their collective data, and not just the digital data associated with it, but the actual samples. I think other people, other communities are to be honest, would have other priorities, but would very much at the minimum want to know what's being done with this data. It's perhaps not a question of we need access, but we need to know what's being done. I think the FNIGC approach is to set a high standard around access to the collective data.
Okay, thanks so much, Aaron. I really appreciate the talk, and we've had some good discussion, and I think we'll just close it there, and thank you again.